Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here. I've spent the day with many of you, and again, I have to apologize if you hear the same jokes. It's been fantastic to hear your stories. It's been fantastic to be in almost 60-degree weather. Although seeing some runners without their shirts, I thought that might be a little bit much, but it's been awesome to be here. It actually feels a little bit of a shame, though, to be on such a great stage that I don't play the organ or anything, but I do have a background that I can talk about culture and identity, and I'm really excited to be here. So I did this Prezi, right? And Prezis are new to me. My students at Northwestern would agree that I'm really, really bad at PowerPoint presentations. So I was so excited when I saw that Prezi had a map, right? And especially, I could illustrate, it had all these crazy arrows, and they have some little illustrations like that dragon for good luck and like a giant carp. So it kind of fits. So I'm gonna use this Prezi to kind of illustrate my life, because it gets pretty confusing. And I'm going to talk about my life because, not to be too self-indulgent, but to talk to you about how I've come to understand my own identity and culture, because it's really complicated and messy, as my title would tell you. Here we go. So if I can get it to work. All right. My story begins in Taiwan, in southern Taiwan, in a city called Taitung. I was born to a family, a very poor rural family, who actually came from an island between China and Taiwan called Jinmen Island. Really itty-bitty, you would never know it. China and Taiwan fought a war there with each other, but my family fled Jinmen Island and went to Taiwan. And they had a lot of girls, and they wanted a boy. Some of you may know that the belief is that boys carry on the family name, they carry on the bloodline, they take care of parents. It's essential in Confucian belief and Chinese culture to have a boy, and that's what my father really especially wanted. So when the opportunity came, they had me in southern Taiwan at a Catholic hospital, and there was a woman there who was a nun. I'm sorry, I like the pointer too. Sister Maureen, and that's me. This little fat little baby right there is me. I was born there, and she knew of a couple in Detroit, in the Detroit area, who wanted to adopt a child. And she's from Detroit as well. And so it was a fortunate moment for me, and they came to an agreement. I was in Taiwan for about 8 months before they were able to get through all the red tape to facilitate my adoption. As an aside, pretty much apropos of nothing, but Taiwan doesn't like to recognize that at that time didn't want to recognize that I was abandoned, so it took a while for me to get to the United States. But thank goodness my parents were very persistent, and so here goes the arrow. I went to America, and I moved to a city called Taylor, Michigan. It's a suburb of Detroit. If you've ever flown into Detroit, any of you have ever been to Detroit? If you've flown in basically my little town. It's not that little, it's about 100,000 people, but most of those people were not Asian. They were either white or African American, but mostly Caucasian. I grew up with 2 Korean brothers. My parents decided they wanted to adopt other Asian children because they wanted to have some kind of Asian experience. And I always joke that my brothers and I probably comprised of the 1% in my city that were Asian. But at that time, I gotta show this picture because it's one of my favorite. The local newspaper ran this with a big headline that said China doll. It's a little, whatever. But I love this picture, and to this day, I love seeing it, my dad's beard and his very big bell bottoms and stuff. But I love this picture, and it just kind of illustrates, you know, that happy moment. And we were really American kids, right? I mean, how can you get more American than Peeps, right? So everything that I knew and wanted to be as a child was American. My parents were ahead of their time in terms of embracing heritage as an international adoptee. I was adopted well before, you know, the wave of Chinese adoptions and Guatemalan adoptions, et cetera, before international adoption became more mainstream. At that time, it was believed that you should just absorb a child into your culture, and not necessarily focus on their difference. But my parents really made an effort to go to festivals, to celebrate holidays, to have Asian or Asian American babysitters. They were thinking about this before other people did. But despite that, I really didn't want to be Asian, and I wanted to be known as an American kid. I was actually ashamed of it in some ways, even though part of me was like, well, I would say I was proud, but I think I was really conscious of being Asian up until I went to college. It was just, I think it's part of the time too. I think the generation nowadays feels a lot different about that sort of identity. But at that time, I was really focused on fitting in. And I think that was normal, even for Asian or other people who are different, that had different backgrounds. I think that was sort of a normal a normal rite of passage or a way to feel about yourself. So, on to the next. So then I choose somewhere even less diverse than my hometown. No, I went to the University of Missouri. And I went there because I wanted to be a journalist, and I really wanted to get out of Michigan, though Missouri was an interesting place to be. The first half of my time in Missouri, I was really not focused on being Asian American still. I was really focused on fitting in. I joined a sorority. I purposefully remember very clearly walking in the study abroad office. I definitely wanted to study abroad, but I totally didn't get anywhere near the red flyer that said China, because I was very focused on kind of breaking the norm and being different from what I thought people might perceive about me. One of the things that I began to recognize when I was in college was that I had stereotypes about my people, right? I would look around and I would see Asian and Asian American students and be really conscious of my own biases and stereotypes about those Asian people. And I got it, and it was a very interesting, and I don't know if difficult is the word, but I had a lot of questions about myself. During the second half of my time in college, though, I began to change. And part of that I attribute to being a part of the Asian American Journalists Association. One of the touchstone things that happened to me was I went to a convention of this organization that is incredibly involved in the Asian American community. It battles stereotypes. It tries to diversify newsrooms, and it was the first time I had been in a big conference room with like 1,000 Asian Americans who wanted to be journalists, and they weren't all Connie Chung, right? And people thought, surely if you want to be a journalist at that time, you wanted to be Connie Chung. So that was a huge shift in what I related to. I began to relate to this difference of being Asian American, but I still didn't think of myself as Chinese. I still was very much, I'm an American, this is my identity. I still was very much not so interested in Taiwan or my birth family. And I forgot to mention that before. I really also had no interest in my birth family. I was really happy with my family. People would ask me, did you always know you're adopted? And I was like, did you see my mom and dad? Because there wouldn't be hiding it in my family. But I really wasn't interested in finding out yet. I mean, I was young. I had a lot on my mind. I wanted a job. Then it happened, right? again, people are always curious about, did you look for them? Did you, what did they find you? Did you find them? And my answer, to put it in a very short, I have a whole book, you can read about it, but it's basically, it happened by accident. Because the nun in the picture that was holding me, she came back to the United States after living many years abroad, and she wanted to meet me again because she was really interested to find out whether things worked out. She had taken care of me for 8 months in Taiwan, and she wanted to know there was a happy ending. So she reached out to me and my family, and I met with her, and she asked me, she said, well, if you ever want to find your birth family, they're probably in the same place you left them. And at the time, I'm early 20s, I was just started my career in journalism. I wasn't real interested, I was interested in guys and my career, but I wasn't interested in that. And I said, well, maybe not, but if you want to reach out to the hospital, if you have old friends, maybe eventually I will. And she took that as no, which it was. And then a year later, I wrote her a holiday card, and I wrote in the holiday card the question, did you write to the hospital? And she took that as right to the hospital. So I immediately got deluged with, I got a letter, I got phone calls, I got faxes, if you want to know how old this is. I got faxes, I got emails, because it was really at the beginning of when email was really starting. And so, of this entreaty, of this family in Taiwan that wanted me to come home. And I, at first, was reluctant, because I was like, this is way too much for me. But I found out I had six sisters that had been raised in Taiwan. They had given me, I was the sixth, and they had kept a sister, and then they had given another sister up for adoption to a family in Switzerland. And those women just kept asking me, come home, come home. They actually were educated, they were funny, they had things to say about what they're interested in. They felt like me a little bit. And it was a really interesting glimpse, and later huge glimpse, into what my life could have been. And they were so inviting, and I could really relate to them that I felt safe in going back that first time. I don't think if it would have just been my birth parents who don't speak any English, I would have gone back so soon. But knowing there was this sort of posse of women there that would protect me and take care of me and wanted me to come home, I felt safe to try to do that. And so I went, and this is from this picture is from the meeting in the airport. And that, you see this really funny fake Hawaiian lei that they gave me. But it was a pretty intense and wonderful experience. When we do the question and answer, I'm happy to talk more about it. But it was a very transforming moment, because I had always been thinking, I'm gonna go work in Latin America, right? And I meet this family. And they are nothing like I thought, and I'm really curious, and so I think, okay, I guess I'll be a little Chinese now. And I started studying Mandarin. I got a fellowship, it's a little arrow, woo, in Hawaii, and that was a lot of work, being in Hawaii. I studied Mandarin there. I studied literature and history and some political systems at a journalism fellowship in Hawaii. And I began to think about what it meant to be Chinese. And I began to ask them questions, and I began to plan trips to Taiwan and get to know them. And my younger sisters came to stay with me, and my older sisters came to Hawaii, and that's the only place that they've been. It was very convenient. But I really, had started to think, oh, maybe I will work in Asia. It was a life change that kind of impacted, my culture very much. It was really, when people see me, they would think that that was my culture, right? They would think that that's the thing that I would want to do, but it wasn't until I really had a connection to it, a real live connection, that I actually felt drawn to it. But life always changes your best laid plans, and so I'm skipping some things because I actually, in the middle of it, I fell in love and I met my husband, and he was a journalist as well, and we moved to DC, and lots of other things happened. My father died, my American father died, and I began to distance myself from the Chinese family. And a lot of it, it's like, was that the reason? Because my father died? I don't know, but it might have been part of it. But I became more distant from the Thai, but this is over years. I just didn't have time too. It's a lot of work to kind of maintain those kinds of relationships. It's a whole lot of work to maintain language. I had gotten to the point with Mandarin that I was able to speak to a cab driver in Beijing and have a conversation about Tiananmen, but I was still not fluent enough to really communicate in a meaningful way. My birth family actually speaks Taiwanese, so I would start sentences with my birth mother and she'd fall back right into Taiwanese. So it was a real difficult journey to, even though I was making all this effort, it really was a difficult journey. So anyway, I'm jumping ahead. So we moved to Buenos Aires, and because my husband worked for the Washington Post, and he was posted there as the bureau chief in Argentina. And it was the sigh of relief, and it was a really interesting thing for me because I've been trying so hard to fit into this new family, adapt kind of a new culture, even though I was still American, but really kind of learn. But once I got to Buenos Aires, I was like, oh my gosh, Latin America really is where I was supposed to be. There was something, and you can kind of even tell me just being up here, I'm very warm, I like to hug people, I'm very proximity, I get too close, and I'm very I'm very, right, there you go, there's an example. I'm very personable and warm, and at its face, Chinese culture, or at least the culture of my family, can be pretty distant and formal. And even though my sisters are super vibrant and they're always, when we're together, it feels very warm. Generally, the culture and the norms and the rules are more distant. And so when I went to Buenos Aires, I was like, oh my gosh, I really feel at home. And I also was very much more comfortable with the language. I had studied it in college. I went to Mexico. I had worked as a journalist in Latin America too. So I felt comfortable with it. And I kind of relaxed into it. One thing, though, that Buenos Aires did allow me to do is to think about what had happened, right? I hadn't had a lot of time to reflect on what getting to know my birth family meant. And I actually did get time there between freelancing to say, okay, maybe I can think about this and maybe I should write a book. And I made one last trip, one more trip to Taiwan in, I think it was 2000, I forget the years, 2006, to kind of ask some unasked questions and to kind of confront some of the questions I had left unanswered by being years away from Taiwan. And the result, right, is this side, not that one. This side was I wrote my book, and again, we can talk about this during the question and answer, but writing really was a way to map out what had happened, to really think about it. And I really had to get to the point where I was ready to write about it, because as I told some of you today, for you to be able to tell your full story, especially in a book, you really have to come to some kind of understanding of what it means first. You have to have perspective. You can be in a crisis or in an identity crisis or have these important things happen to you, but unless you really can talk about or write about what it means, your readers won't find that meaning just out of you telling it. I mean, you can listen to me talk about my crazy Chinese family, but ultimately you'll want to know, what did they mean to me, and in the end, what did it all mean if you're writing a book? And it took me those 10 years to really get to that point where I could, in a book form, I could write little essays, but in a book form say, okay, well, this was, the role that family can play in your life and that you can choose, right? I'm gonna talk a little bit about culture and choosing, but you can't change who your family is, but you can choose where you move forward. And I had to come to that. In the spirit of this being a multimedia presentation, I have my book trailer from that. So in some of this, you'll have seen the pictures.
Some people spend their lives trying to uncover, understand, or escape their past. Mine rose up like a dragon, fast and furious. I was blissfully ignorant, a sleeping ox about to be discovered and devoured. I was born in the year of the ox, just another one of the endless unwanted baby girls born to and discarded by poor Chinese families. I arrived in the U.S. one April afternoon in 1974. I was 8 months old. My mom said that for one split second in that airport, I was a dark, foreign bundle, someone else's child. But once in her arms, I was theirs. My birth parents were shadows known to me only in the folds of my eyelids, the curve of my chin, or the shiny dark of my hair. Then one day, when I was 23, what followed was a journey. Between countries, between families, between destinies. At turns joyful, amusing, and disturbing. Why had I been given up? Why did I need the ugly truth? And why did I stick around once I knew? Was it a deep-seated need to be part of this family? An attempt to know myself better? Journalistic curiosity? Or all of the above?
So anyway, that's, I ended up writing a book. It was a pretty easy thing at that point once I got going and once I sold the book. It probably took 6 months to write, but remember it took 10 years to experience. So I was able to do that, and that was a big sort of, I guess, milestone in my identity and figuring some things out. The other big thing, important thing that was born, right, were my children. And as those of you who are parents know, children are very disruptive in terms of your identity and even your culture. They change everything about your life, pretty much. It was really interesting to me to have a baby in a different country. I spoke today to the early childhood class about this. It was fascinating to me to think about how people in Argentina treated pregnant women, families, etc. The example that leads my book that I wrote about this is that, children in Argentina stay up until like midnight at restaurants, and you'll see them running around, and nobody's giving them nasty looks, and it's and there's real cultural reasons for that. But I started thinking a lot about parenting in different cultures. So that's the book, and that was the last slide. that I ended up writing is how Eskimos keep their babies warm. And it was sort of this journey of different cultures and how they approach different parts of parenting. So that was a big thing in my life. But yes, definitely the kids changed things. It also changed it also sort of challenged my view of myself as well, and looking at the way they were realizing at one point that they were experiencing already as young children a different cultural and racial identity than I did, meaning people saw them differently than they saw me when I was little. They see themselves and the way they fit into society differently than I do. And it was just an interesting thing. There was no good and bad about it, but it was like they're going to go through the rest of their lives experiencing a racial identity different than I do, because they really are different. And I mean, logically you think that, but really realizing it when suddenly I was an Asian mom. I'm like, that's kind of weird. Like I'm going to be that short little Asian mom because they're going to grow up and my husband's like 6'4" and they're going to be taller than me in about 2 years. So it was just really interesting to kind of realize that in terms of identity. The other thing culturally is we made a shift. So we moved. In 2012, we went back to the United States. I was offered a job at Northwestern in the journalism department teaching, and we thought it would be a good moment to kind of go back. We had resisted for weather and for also, but very much for the reasons I kind of hinted to. In South America, it was just super friendly for families. They were welcome everywhere. We had a nanny. We had help. And that's a huge, huge difference. So we resisted going back to the States, but finally when we did, the first thing I did when I went back is go on a mad search to figure out how to keep their Spanish, because the oldest was 4 when we moved back, and I was obsessed almost to the point of like, bilingualism is such a gift, and it's so hard to get that back. I needed to try, and it was actually really hard. And even in a place like Chicago that's super diverse and has a huge Mexican-American population, it was hard. There was the French Lycée, which is the French government funds all over the world, but there wasn't an equivalent in Chicago in Spanish. There were some magnet schools, but after searching, we actually lucked out and found one in Evanston, where Northwestern is. We found a preschool that's Spanish-speaking, and that we found that Evanston also had what's called the two-way immersion program, which is for Spanish speakers not enter right away, and for English speakers it's a lottery. So we were admitted, thank goodness, because I would have been devastated if we didn't get in. And so I'm working so hard at keeping my daughter's connection to the Spanish-speaking world. And we go back to Argentina. We try to go every year. I have a program there, and conveniently it's winter in Chicago and summer there. I don't hide my boss always makes fun of me because he's like, yeah, I know you wanted to start a Buenos Aires program. But which boxes do we check? I think it's really it's amusing because I'm like, what are we? What is in the census, right? The definition of Hispanic or Latino is very culturally based. I mean, the exact quote is the definition of a Hispanic or Latino is a person of Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, South or Central American or other Spanish culture or origin, regardless of race. So it's this vague thing, right? It's not really a race. It's more culturally and language based, or even not, because there are a lot of Hispanic people who don't speak Spanish. So it was like when I mark off what we are, I'm like, okay. It used to be complicated before, but now it's super complicated. And what exactly do my kids relate to, right? they would say, one of the students today, brilliant question, asked me, well, so what do your children relate to? And I'm like, I think they would probably relate more to being Latino or having a Latino background, when racially, really, they're Chinese. And my daughter gives me all kinds of grief because she wants me to teach her Mandarin. And I'm like, Mom's gonna have to practice a little first before we get to that. But, they're just, it's so interesting now. And you can I always joke that nobody really knows they're Asian unless I'm around. If you saw them, you look at them if you know me and you go, oh yeah, surely. But my mom says to me, my mom who loves me, and she's like, there is no Asian in those children. And I'm like, I know I had them. But they could fit into so many situations and really could be anything. And it's really an interesting difference. I'll digress a little. I do that a lot, I'm sorry. My Korean adoptees, they were never able to meet their birth families, but they married Korean women. And not Korean American women, they married Korean women. And they speak Korean in their homes. Well, the children speak Korean in their homes. And at one point, I was living in Argentina, and I came back for Thanksgiving, and we all got together for Thanksgiving, and we had turkey and stuffing and kimchi and japchae and all kinds of dishes that I don't even know what the names are. And they said the prayer, because my brothers, we were not really religious growing up, but they have gotten involved with the Korean church. And they did a prayer in Korean, and I turned to my mom and I'm like, when did our family turn Korean? Because it's just amazing the transformation that has occurred in my family. And, and that's all good. I'm gonna go back to the map. So, I guess in summary, I think we like to think about things like culture and identity and diversity in this sort of stagnant way often. We talk about it as something that's unchanging, and we talk about who has it and who doesn't, right? We think about as it's something like you'd have in a museum. A culture is just something that you're given. Though I admire young people, I think that the generation, all of you in college, have a different experience with culture and identity. I think, I see the students at Northwestern, there's a new mixed race coalition. It's really interesting, some of the things they're doing and the conversations they're having. I advised a student from Hong Kong who who really grew up in the Midwest, but she's from Hong Kong and she's been in international schools, and she has such an interesting background and a view of diversity that breaks molds, right? And breaks the things that you assume about people. And even today here at Elon, I met students from Ethiopia, China, Brazil, and from New Jersey and North Carolina who have really complex, interesting identities and cultural identities. And I think, everyone really has their unique journey and their unique map. For me, and I've talked about this with families of adopted international children, culture is something that's organic. And it's not just composed of your heritage or your background or your parents or the places that you grew up, but it's also made up of the experiences you have, the people who have had influence on your life, the things you're interested in. We are a fusion of all these things, and while we may not be able to change where we're from, we have a choice in where we take it. We can choose where we live. We can choose what we'll eat. We can choose what traditions we will teach our children. We may not, we really do have a big hand in who we will become. And I feel very much in motion in terms of who I am, who my children are. And I've been thinking a lot about home and what that is. especially when I'm really cold in Chicago and thinking maybe home should be somewhere else. You know, ultimately, I think home is something inside you. I know that sounds very cliche, but, and that you're made up of a lot of different experiences and with people, with places, and I just think that it's so much more complex and interesting than the straightforward thing that we like to say that is identity and culture. Yeah, I mean, like, and this is such a cheesy, like, metaphor, I know, but I was doing this Prezi, right, and I'm terrible at PowerPoints, and there's this little, like, button on the thing, and I kept messing up, and it said edit path, right, edit path, and I kept putting things out of order and trying to figure it out, and, you know, but I did feel like, I'm like, oh my gosh, that is such a good comparison to, like, I'm constantly sort of editing path. And I think even if I decide to stay in Evanston or what we decide to do, you know, you can always kind of edit that path, and it's not, even if it's just inside or internal. You know, it's so much beyond the boxes and the maps and everything. But I mean, I really think that that's what has made my life so interesting. And I really, you know, I'm excited to see where it's going to lead me next. That's a speech.